Hello, everybody. Josh Neighbors here, Locked On Big 12 podcast. Joining us today, it is Johnathan Davis, the host of the Locked On Longhorns podcast. It is officially football season, or spring football season, I should say. Baseball and obviously softball going on as well. But we're going to talk Texas football. The big question, are they back? Is Texas back? We'll talk about that and a whole lot more coming up on today's show.
Locked On Big 12, your daily podcast on the Big 12 Conference, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Once again, hello, everybody. Josh Neighbors here, Locked On Big 12 podcast. Johnathan Davis, Locked On Longhorns podcast. Johnathan, it's nice to talk to you again.
Yes, sir. I'm glad to be back on Locked On Big 12 talking everything Texas football today.
So one thing before we get to football, basketball season ends against Purdue. But they got an NCAA tournament win, which is more they can say under Shaka Smart. So would you say, all in all, successful first campaign for Chris Beard?
Definitely a successful first campaign for Chris Beard. Like you said, getting the monkey off our back, being able to win an NCAA tournament game. I think that the team was overrated coming into the season, like a preseason top 5 team, because all of the transfers came in. So I think that, that kind of elevated expectations, higher than they should have been. And then when you don't beat Baylor and when you don't beat Texas Tech, I think that kind of soured the season. But they did beat Kansas, who won the national championship game, beat Virginia Tech, who was really hot, and your team, Virginia Tech, and won the ACC tournament.
Yeah.
And then lost to Purdue. Of course, there was a big foul discrepancy in that game, 46-12, and a lot of people talk about that. But overall, I thought it was a good season, and he's bringing in 2 5-stars next year. I think as he continues to actually get his players into the program and not have to rely so much on the transfer portal, you'll see much more improvement from this basketball team. So I'm happy with what Chris Beard did in year 1.
I think a lot of people are the same way. All right, let's talk some Texas football, because that's what everybody wants to talk about. So I've been thinking about having this conversation with you about expectations and whatnot. And the one thing that we always love to do is the Texas back thing. I think the big thing for Texas is preparing for the SEC, right? And up front on both sides of the ball, that's important. Making sure they have the right coach. At this point, I think they do, to be honest, to go to the Southeastern Conference. Not really worrying about is Texas back, but is that the main concern right now for Texas fans? I know it's it's a little bit off, 3 years away, whatever it is, but I think that's kind of the big thing looming over Texas football right now. Is look, it's great if you're back, whatever, 10-2, but the big thing is you need to be prepared for the SEC.
Yeah, I think that's one of the big things, but I think honestly Texas fans are more worried about this season. I think this is a huge season for the program and a huge season for Sark in his second year to determine if he is the right coach or not, right? Most of us think he is. I think he is too. But coming off a 5-7 season when you lost to Kansas, I mean, that was Charlie Strong's downfall. So, if Sark can't build on that and they come out and, only win 6 or 7 games this year, then it doesn't matter what you're going to do in the SEC in a few years. So I think there's a lot of hype around this team right now. I'm going to shy away from saying Texas is back when I do say that. The fans kind of get on me. This team has been cursed. The fans have been hurt. So I'm not going to say that. But I think what's more important than what we do in the SEC in a few years is what happens this year. This is a huge year for the program to really determine if Texas can get back on the right track. And there's a lot of energy around the program. When you bring in the 5th ranked recruiting class in the country, you bring in Quinn Ewers, who most people expect to start. So I think more importantly, fans are worried about who we can secure in the recruiting class. We'll probably talk about that a little bit, Arch Manning and stuff too. But definitely this season, I think is on the forefront of Texas fans right now, their minds right now.
Yeah, it's the Big 12 is really interesting. It's going to be super interesting this year because it feels like I do think Oklahoma is a clear favorite. I think just because of the amount of talent they have, and also the fact that you get a proven commodity in Dylan Gabriel, quarterback. I like that they still have some talent that's turning. I just think it's it's I know it's the brand of Oklahoma, but it's such a sturdy program that it feels like they've really done a great job rebounding from the loss. And now we'll see, obviously, but loss of Lincoln Riley. But there's a lot of positivity about where that program is. And then I think The questions are like, okay, can Baylor do it again? Can Oklahoma State do it again? What about the Kansas States of the world? There always seems to be that one team that we kind of count out that makes that push, kind of towards the top of the Big 12 standings, and Texas Tech, Iowa State, Kansas State, in that group. And then I think it's just with Texas, like I really do believe Texas should be in the Big 12 championship this year. I think with the amount of talent that Texas has and kind of where the conference is as a whole, I'm not even sure this team has to reach its full potential to make a Big 12 championship game. I actually think that with the way the conference is positioned, once again, it's early, but I think with the amount of talent and kind of starting to get the right guys in there, and the coaching needs to improve a little bit too. But I think that's where this team, talent-wise at least, should be. Do you agree, in the Big 12 championship, or at least in the conversation this year?
Yeah, I've said that plenty of times on the podcast, and my glasses are rose colored for sure. But
Right.
I definitely think that they should be in the Big 12 championship. And that's where I've projected them to be at the end of the season. There's no clear cut favorite, regardless of how you feel about, Oklahoma and them coming in with Brent Venables. They're not head and shoulders above everybody in the Big 12. Baylor, who won the Big 12 last year, there's a realistic possibility that they could take a step back, losing some of the players that they did. Of course, Oklahoma State, with that defense, as many players as they lost, it's hard to envision them being as good. And so when you look at Texas last year, yeah, we were a 5-win team, but you scored 56 points against Kansas. You shouldn't lose that game. Shouldn't have lost the Oklahoma game. Had leads on Oklahoma State and Baylor. So even with all the deficiencies on this team last year, this was, could have been an 8 to 9 win team. I guess if it was a fifth, we know the rest, but it could have been a 9-win team. And so now you've improved on a lot of units. I think you brought in some coaches that the players have been able to resonate with more. And then it's just the second year in Pete Kwiatkowski's scheme on defense, second year in Sark's scheme on offense. I think the team is more comfortable. And honestly, I think this group is focused on getting to a Big 12 championship. I think they want to be the group that turns this Texas team around, not necessarily brings them back. But, Anthony Cook, at safety talked about that. Like, he played in the Big 12 championship his freshman year, and they haven't been back since. And so, like I said, the SEC move, that's something down the road. But I definitely think that this team is focused on getting to a Big 12 championship this year. And I think they have more than enough talent to do it in a year where there's no clear-cut favorite in the Big 12 like we've seen in the past.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. Let's get to some specifics here. But first, quick word from our sponsors. Today's show is Built Bar. Go to built.com today. That's built.com. You guys can find all of the delicious Built Bar flavors that they've got there right now. Mint brownie, coconut almond, coconut, and white chocolate cookies and cream. Most Built Bars have 130 calories, 4 grams of sugar, 4 net carbs, and 17 grams of protein. Once again, built.com today. Built.com, promo code LOCK15, LOCKED 15, LOCK15 for 15% off at built.com today. And yeah, when it comes to I think when it comes to the SEC thing, like I want to see them play better up front. So it's like, okay, this is going somewhere, right? Because this is the thing. If Oklahoma goes 10-2 this year, but their defensive line still looks like all the other defensive lines that we've talked about, like, great, but where are we going, right? Are we going to get better at that point? And Texas, they have a lot of talent on the outside and other spots as well. Quarterback, great, but if the defensive line is getting run down late in games, the offensive line's not holding up, then how close are we to actually being a team that can make talent perform? So that's kind of my thought. I know it's far off, but I think it would translate to wins the immediate. But like those are the things that I'm looking for, because we know they can get guys like Xavier Worthy. We know we can get guys like Xavier Worthy the football and watch them work. But that's not wins and lose. That's not what wins and loses games for them, at least at this point.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's why they, made such a huge emphasis. One, just because those were weaknesses last year, the defensive line and the offensive line. And so I think they, heavily keyed in on that in the recruiting class. And then also looking on the defensive side, on the defensive line and the transfer portal, still looking at O'Shawn Mathis from TCU. But I think they've keyed in on those type of players, like you said, that'll be able to win games, kind of those beefy, just stronger players in the trenches that you need to win in the SEC. So I think they've done a good balance of getting players that can come in and contribute for them right now, whether that's on the edge or on the offensive and defensive lines. But I also think, they're kind of looking towards the future and saying these are the type of players in the trenches that we need to win games when we ultimately move to the SEC. And so I think they've keyed in more on those bigger guys in the trenches, knowing that that's where the team is headed in a few years.
Yeah, O'Shawn Mathis, like what the hell are we doing? Like he's one of those dudes. He's just sitting there, right? He hadn't decided what he's doing yet.
Yeah, he's just enjoying the recruitment process for
Yeah,
sure. You
which
know,
good for him. But I feel like he'd want to get in for some spring football, right? Like
that's what I was thinking. I saw something that said maybe he was, trying to finish up his classes before he made a decision or something. So I'm not sure. I saw something the other day about Nebraska making the
yeah,
NIL pitch towards him.
Yeah, he's going to visit there.
Casey Thompson talked about them having NIL and cars out there in Nebraska that we don't have at Texas. So hopefully Nebraska doesn't scoop him up too. But I definitely hope he makes a decision sooner than later. Especially, I know defensive line is still an area that we're working on in spring practices. So hopefully we can get O'Shawn in if he makes Texas his decision sooner than later.
Everybody wants to talk offense with Texas, right? I mean, it's and for good reason. I mean, they've got some good players coming back. Obviously, I think the guys they bring in are really interesting. We'll get there in a second, but the heat is on Pete Kwiatkowski because that unit in particular was the one that really folded in a lot of games. I mean, they were giving it up to basically everybody they played. Oklahoma to Baylor to Oklahoma State. I mean, you name it. And the teams that we considered good, the only game where they really stood their ground was that Kansas State game late in the season, I thought. And the heat's on Pete Kwiatkowski. Also, I think there is some added pressure when you bring in a guy like Gary Patterson, right? Like, if it doesn't work out, I mean, there are a lot of people at Texas who I'm sure you know this would love to see him get that DC spot, and I'm sure he'd love to have it too, to be able to coach for Texas, just to stick it to his old school TCU. He's a little bit of a vindictive guy, that's how he is. So that's where I think that's where my questions go, because the offense last year, I think it's a lot more fixable than what happened on defense.
Yeah, definitely. And you're right. There's definitely pressure on Pete Kwiatkowski when you bring in a defensive guru like Gary Patterson. And, I think people think if Pete Kwiatkowski can't get it together, or some people that think that Gary Patterson might be in that position by the end of the season, and so a lot of pressure on him. But you're right. Definitely a unit that needs to improve. I think it was like 99th or 100th in the country last year. And so a lot of emphasis has been on that side of the ball, but we've also been hearing some really good things coming out of spring practices about the defense, especially in the defensive backfield. A couple of the superstars from spring practices so far, Jade Baron really keyed in that nickel star spot. I think they like what he's going to be able to do to be able to play man coverage in the slot, but just also bring a lot, to that defensive backfield. He's been probably one of the best players in spring practices so far. And then the transfer, Ryan Watts from Ohio State, 6'3", long corner. He's really brought a different dynamic to this defensive backfield where I don't think you had any standout players last year. So 6'3", like I said, long arms. And Sark talked about in his last press conference wanting to be more sticky in coverage. And so he really helps you do that. Like I said, long corner. He's, when he presses on you, it's just hard to get a release off of him. And I think that's really brought something to the defense. This is a defense that wants to play a lot more man coverage this year. You bring in two talented 4-star freshmen at corner and Jalen Gilbo and Terrence Brooks, who are looking really good in the spring, are threatening for some playing time this year as well. So I think that's one of the biggest keys in that defensive backfield. And Gary Patterson has a lot to do with that as well, as them wanting to play more man coverage, be stickier in coverage, and not give up so many easy completions on that side of the ball this year.
And then so you look at the guys, that we're thinking about, the two guys that I point to also in the heart of the defense, Keandre Coburn and then DeMarvion Overshown. Those were two guys that I think I thought Overshown played better than Coburn did last year, but I think we expected a lot more, especially from Coburn, right? That was a guy that we really did expect more out of. And I thought he, much like the rest of the defensive line, disappointed last year. What are you hearing about this defensive front? It's a pretty old one, but just because you're experienced, that doesn't always necessarily mean you're good, right?
Yeah, definitely. So I think Alfred Collins, Keandre Coburn, they both didn't have the seasons that you would have expected from two talented interior linemen. And then, so as far as the defensive front, I think that we're hearing that they've looked good in the run game. They're playing, more aggressively, playing with more pursuit. They're more aggressive in their pursuit to the ball, that the pass rush still isn't where they would like it to be. I know they've been experimenting recently, and it's just something you can see a lot more this year with 3 down linemen, with the 3-man fronts, with, Keandre Coburn, Alfred Collins, and then either Tavondre Sweat or Byron Murphy up front. And then as far as the edge positions, they're looking at, Ovi Ogofu. I think he's probably their most consistent edge right now. But then outside of that, they don't have just a playmaker right now that I think they can rely on and say, okay, he's going to be on the other side of OV. You got Justice Finkley in on the early enrollee freshman. You got Baron Sorrells, the sophomore, who they really like. But I think they're still expecting a little bit more from them. So I think the defensive front is still a work in progress, especially with the pass rush. But I think the biggest adjustment is them trying to move more towards a 3-man front, at least in certain situations, to be able to utilize those big interior tackles up front and be disruptive in the run game, and then also see how they can bring pressure off of that with the 3-man front. So didn't have the seasons you wanted to from Keandre Coburn and Alfred Collins last year. But I think they're expecting a big jump from them, and it's going to be huge if this defense wants to improve.
So let's go offense. This is where everybody wants to talk about. So I guess it's technically a quarterback battle, right?
Yeah, for sure.
With Hudson Card and totally like Quinn Ewers. You don't bring a player like that into the program unless you plan on playing him, right? That's what you do when you bring a guy who's got that much pedigree and that much talent. Last year, I think Steve Sarkisian was honest with us about how poorly the quarterbacks were playing, maybe a little bit too honest. So is that honesty continued this offseason, or is it more tempered optimism? Because last year he was like, I don't really know who to play. None of these guys really impressed me yet, which I understand. It's fine. These aren't your players. But now maybe you're getting kind of more guys in. Maybe you do want to be a bit more positive. I think he knew what he had last year, and I don't think people kind of realized that until it was far later in the season. But I think maybe this year he'd do better with some positivity, I think. At least try to boost some confidence, maybe.
Yeah, so in his most recent press conference, he talked about how both of them are doing really good things. He's been a little more stealthy at this point.
Yeah.
But he said both of them are doing some really good things. But from what I'm hearing and most people are saying, neither one has really separated themselves from the other. Of course, Quinn Ewers is kind of behind the curve in terms of Hudson Card, just with him having more time on campus and being more familiar in the system, being more familiar with the teammates, et cetera. Also trying to be more vocal in a leadership type role. But of course, Quinn Ewers jumps off the page in terms of talent, and he can make throws that nobody else in that quarterback room can make. And then we're still hearing, as far as Hudson Card, that he's been good, but once again, he's not been able to separate himself from Quinn Ewers when he has a natural advantage. Too, we're also hearing that at times, which we saw last year, he's still struggling, in the pocket in terms of dealing with pressure and being able to stand in there and deliver the ball to receivers. And that was something that plagued him a lot last year. So very interesting up until this point in the quarterback battle. I don't think anybody has separated themselves from each other thus far, which I think definitely benefits the mullet and Quinn Ewers, because if Hudson Card can't, definitively beat him in this quarterback battle, I said it on the podcast all the time, we've seen that movie before, and it might be time to, hand the reins to the prodigy in Quinn Ewers.
Yeah, I think in my opinion, at least, it's kind of trending in that direction. Now, things could change, but I mean, I think that's where we thought it was going to happen. Offensive line, I know we'll talk receivers here in a second, but this offensive line, are we going to see these 2 5-stars, Devon Campbell and Kelvin Banks, compete for some of those starting spots, right? This defensive line, you filter guys in and out sometimes, but offensive line usually aren't going to filter in linemen in and out. So are those 2 guys going to be fighting for starting positions, you think, this year, or no, going to have to kind of wait a little bit and see?
Yeah, I think Kelvin Banks, when he comes in over the summer, definitely has a chance to compete with Christian Jones at that right tackle spot. I think they like Andre Carriage at left tackle and what he can do, and I think the big key for him is consistency. But definitely with Christian Jones at right tackle, I think Kelvin Banks has a chance to come in and compete for that spot right away. I'm not sure with Devon Campbell at the left guard or right guard spot. I know that Cole Hudson, the only one of the 7 offensive linemen that they brought in that's on campus right now, he has a really good chance. They like what they see to compete for that right guard spot. Right now, he's getting second team reps, but I think eventually most people think that he'll take the starting spot at right guard eventually, even at some point this year. But at left guard, I think they like what they have in Junior, and they're just expecting more consistency out of him. But because there's not a lot of depth on campus at the offensive line positions right now, they're getting so many reps. And I think they like what they've seen on the left side from Andre and Junior so far at left tackle and left guard. So I think that if out of Devin Campbell and Kelvin Banks. Kelvin Banks has a legitimate shot to compete for that right tackle spot this year. Of course, Devin Campbell with his pedigree has a legit chance to compete. But I think if I had to pick one that would possibly starting on day one, it would be Kelvin Banks at right tackle rather than Devin Campbell at left guard.
And then wide receivers, let's go there. I mean, this is a group that's really gotten bolstered. They're going to have, starting off, I mean, a bunch of experienced guys. You know, you think about Xavier Worthy coming back. I would call him a 1,000-yard receiver. I know he didn't get all the way there, but, you know, in terms of talent, like this is a guy who was, you know, and he was right there. He just didn't get over that hump. That was more quarterback than anything. So they get Isaiah Nair, and this is somebody that people are really excited about. They steal him from Tennessee. You and I talked about him before, but this is a guy that I think when you get a quarterback like Quinn Ewers, having a player like Worthy, and then Nair's pretty big kid, right? Like 6'4". What is 6'4"?
Yeah, I think he's like 6'3", 220.
Yeah, so he's a bigger guy they bring in there, and then also you get Jalil Billingsley from Alabama, who to me is a massive wild card, but he reunites with Steve Sarkisian. You get Jordan Whittington, who's back from another. I feel like he's been there for a long time. He's back. So, you know, in terms of pass catching options, and then also in the backfield, Bijan Robinson and Roschon Johnson both back again. I mean, this is going to be a pretty loaded group in terms of experience and also ability.
Yeah, Sark has a lot of toys to play with. Of course, Xavier Worthy, like you said, 1,000-yard receiver. If he would have played in a bowl game, he definitely would have been a 1,000-yard receiver.
Oh, yeah.
And then, you know, Jordan Whittington, I think they like a lot what he's been able to do with his body. I think they have more confidence that he'll be able to play a full season for the first time this year. They love what he's doing in the slot. Sark mentioned in his press conference this week that he's been one of the best players in the spring, especially his ability to make plays and get yak over the middle. So they like what he can do in the slot. We talked about the addition of Isaiah Nair, whose best ability is to win jump balls, you know, those 50-50 balls with his size. But he also has deceptive speed. This was a track star in high school, somebody that can run by you as well. So originally the thought was that, you know, he could come in and take pressure off of Xavier Worthy and make it harder for you to double him or roll coverage over to Xavier Worthy. But now I'm kind of looking at it at a, you know, 1A, 1B type of situation. You know, I don't think it's necessarily a Robin to the Batman. I think it's, you know, Isaiah Nair comes in and can be, you know, one of the top receivers in the country as well, especially in Sark's system and a quarterback that can get the ball to all of the playmakers. So you talked about it. And then at tight end, you got Jalil Billingsley, who's looked really good as a receiver. I'm not sure how much they'll be able to use him as an inline blocker just because of his frame. And we know that's not something that we've seen a lot from him before, only at 216 pounds. But he gives you a hell of a pass catching option at tight end or even split out wide sometimes. And then, you know, JT Sanders, who didn't catch a pass last year, but has come on really well at the tight end position too. So Sark has a million toys to play with, and it'll be interesting to see how often we see the different formations and personnel groupings and how he utilizes them going forward in the season.
Yeah, I think Nair and Worthy are two really good complementary players, and Whittington too. I just think they all kind of do different stuff. Worthy too is just a guy you can, you know, Tyreek Hill is a good comparison. Like you give him the ball and just like, okay, go get me 3 or 4 yards, right? You know, or give me 5 or 6 yards. I mean, the first play we saw that first play they ran against OU, the one I forgot how long he took for a touchdown, but how many times do we see Devontae Smith run that play at Alabama, right? Just the quick pop outside and let your, you know, brilliantly talented player go make something happen. And he's not just that. He's got a lot more in the bag. You know, he can go downfield too. But this is, I think it's a great point. It's like these guys all make sense together. And so to me is if the offensive line is playing well, and look, you mentioned it, they now got some options, maybe not a ton of depth, but they've got some youthful options, at least some talented options behind the guys who are starters. If that works out, this, you know, there's no excuse for a quarterback not to play well. I mean, there's no excuse for a quarterback not to play well. What else could you want if you're a quarterback besides, you know, maybe a great tight end? But I mean, you can't have everything, right? You know what I mean? Like you can't have everything, but pretty loaded across the board. I mean, 2 running backs, 3 or 4 good wide receivers, a pseudo tight end in Jalil Billingsley. Like this is, if you're a quarterback, man, you're setting me up pretty good for success.
Yeah, and I think we have more than 2 running backs, honestly. You look at Keelan Robinson, who was running back 3, really talented player, extremely fast, might be the second fastest player on the team behind Xavier Worthy. Freshman Jaden Blue out of Houston, he's looked really good. Jonathan Brooks at running back, he's looked really good. Jordan Whittington tweeted that we have the best running back room in the country. I'm not going to argue with him there. So like you said, just a lot of talented options that Sark has to play with. with different personnel groupings and different things. But as we know, games are won in the trenches, and it's hard to get the ball to those playmakers if you're constantly under duress. So hopefully when, the other 6 offensive linemen from the 2022 class get there over the summer, they can make some real decisions about who's going to start in the fall. And hopefully this group is more dominant in the trenches and more cohesive than they were last year to ensure that this offense can have the type of season. It looks good on paper right now, but you just got to go out there and play the games. But I think if the offensive line improves, then Texas is one of the scariest teams in the country on paper.
Quick word from our sponsors. Today's show is brought to you by BetOnline and BetOnline.net. If you want to get on some college football futures, you want to bet some overs, maybe you're feeling pumped up about this Texas conversation. You say, all right, I want to take the over on Texas wins next year. You can do that at BetOnline and BetOnline.net. You can bet on basketball, football, baseball, hockey, soccer, MMA, golf, NASCAR, whatever it is you want to bet on, they got there. Also, they've got Vegas casino games as well. It's the best online sportsbook experience. Go there today. BetOnline and BetOnline.net. BetOnline, it's where the game starts. All right, so a couple questions here, and we'll get you out of here. But we'll just talk about like the win numbers. I know this stuff is all, it's all about progress, but we measure progress by wins. I look at the schedule, and I just think to myself, just here it is: ULM, Alabama, UTSA, Texas Tech, West Virginia, Oklahoma, Iowa State, Oklahoma State, Kansas State, TCU, Kansas, Baylor. So there's a stretch in there where it is Oklahoma at Iowa State, Oklahoma home for Iowa State, at Oklahoma State, and then at K-State. Like that's a difficult stretch. But it's not this inconquerable stretch where, it's really horrible. The Alabama game, obviously, earlier in the season, going to be a really difficult one at home, but it's going to be a, very much pumped up one. I'm just wondering, like, what dictates success this year? Because there's so many factors. There's the pressure, there's the schedule, there's what happened last year, there's the amount of talent they have. Like, you have to mix all of those things together and think, okay, what is appropriate expectations? All right, so like, if a fan, a positive fan were to say, Johnathan, I think Texas should go 9-3 next year, you would say what to that?
I agree. Okay. I don't think that Texas isn't the type of program where you can say, okay, we went 5-7 next year, just improving on our win total will be enough. Like, this is a team, especially we talked about all the talent. Like, this is a team that fans expect to be able to compete for a Big 12 championship. And then when you look at the schedule, obviously Alabama is daunting for sure, in that second week of the season. But I think this is a 9-3, 10-2 football team. I think if you're asking me, I'll say 10-2 or 9-3. I think, probably Alabama is a loss. I think one school out of Oklahoma State, and Baylor, you could take your pick on that, will be a loss. I think it'll hard to go 3-0 against those teams. Yeah. But outside of that, I think that, we should be able to beat every other team on our schedule. So I'm thinking 10-2. I think most fans would say 9-3, but I think Big 12 championship is how most Texas fans would describe success. I think anything less than that,
I would say winning one or playing in the game. I think it'd be a major success if they. I know it's a really talented team. I think it's a major success if they play in the game.
You don't want to get to the game and not win it. So
yeah, I know.
I think that
fair here.
Yeah. You're right. I think if Texas got to the Big 12 championship game and they were very competitive in that game and lost, I think most fans will be confident in Sarkisian, the players we have, and the team moving forward. So I think most fans would describe that as a successful season if they got to the game and, didn't embarrass themselves, or wet the bed. So I think if they got to the game and were competitive in the game and lost, I think fans would be excited about the outlook of the team. So, yeah, we could say just getting to the Big 12 championship would be a successful season for most fans.
I'm thinking at this point, and look, this is so early to think about this, 9-3. Like I think with this amount of talent in this conference, look, like there are some really difficult games. Playing at Oklahoma State, playing at Boone Pickens is a really difficult game, right? Playing, at Kansas and Manhattan, it can be a really difficult game. But luckily for them, a lot of these, playing Lubbock in your fourth game can be difficult. If they do take care of business, like, go 2-1 in those first couple games, then, you win at Texas Tech and West Virginia. You're like, all right, we're in a good spot. We're 5-1. So I just want to see, like a week to week consistency, right? Like if they get bounced, if they get killed by Alabama, not going to hold it too much against them. If they come out and look flat the next week, then I'm worried because then you're thinking, okay, we got Lubbock, we're in Lubbock next week, and There's a lot of juice behind that. So I just think it's going to be really important to track because it fell off a cliff last year. It's going to be important to track, like, how does this Texas team rebound? Do they, things like, I know it's intangible, character, because they didn't show much character late in games last year. Like, that's the stuff I'm looking to see. So it's a 9-3 that feels volatile, but it's like if they respond in some of their early games and they're at like 4 and if they're like, 5-1, I'll be like, okay, I feel really good about where they're going. But I just think it's like, okay, what's going to happen when they get punched in the mouth in a game and then in a season they don't play well for a little while? How's it going to go for them?
Yeah, I think like you said, it has to be 9-3 or 10-2 or above. Because even if you look at 8-4, that means you probably lost to Alabama. That means you lost probably 2 out of 3 or 3 out of the 3 to Oklahoma, Baylor, or Oklahoma State. And if it wasn't those 3, then you lost to a team you definitely shouldn't have lost to. And so that's why I said like 8-4. It would be an improvement, of course, from 5-7, a 3-win improvement, but I don't think that's what Texas fans are looking for. I think with the talent, like you said, that we have, with the potential superstar we have at quarterback, the position coaches that Sark has brought in, I think they've all been a massive hit so far. Just what they've been able to do with the team, but also from what recruits have said, there's just a different energy around this football team, especially with them buying in more than they did last year. Roshan, who's the leader of the team, talked about that. There's just more buy-in, more energy this year. So I think it has to be a 9-3 season, and it has to be a season where they're playing in the Big 12 championship game to validate everything we've been hearing in the spring. Because, of course, everything is, like I said, rose-colored right now. But once you get out there on the field and every team is trying to throw those horns down and beat you, you got to go out there and execute. And we didn't see that last year.
It's really interesting. What record do you think would cost Sark his job?
7-6.
You think they fire him
7-5?
I don't think they can him at 7-5.
I think. Yeah. So you're talking about firing him. Yeah.
Firing. Honestly, I think it has to, I think you have to miss a bowl again to not fire. I think 7-6 might be safe, but like major heat third year, obviously.
Yeah. Like definitely on the hot seat. I think for them to fire him after year 6, I mean, he would have to be like 6-6, 5-7. But I think 7-5. I mean, because you heard rumblings, after the first year, and so
you're always going to hear that though at Texas. But it's always going to be
But I'm saying even if they go 7-5, like I said, that means you lost to some teams that you definitely shouldn't have lost to, right? And you didn't, it's a Michigan situation where you can't beat all the teams that you're supposed to beat in your conference or the teams that the fans want to beat. So I think 7-5, he may not get fired, but he's going to be on the hottest seat in the country at Texas if they go 7-5 next year.
It's going to be really interesting to see. I mean, I think they're so talented, and I think this conference in a way is for the taking. But the thing is, it feels like some of these these other teams just feel more established, right? I know Dave Aranda's only 2 years, but like what you're going to get from Baylor. Mike Gundy is very good at adapting to what he's got. So it's going to be a really difficult game. Going to Manhattan, Kansas is going to be a tough game. Going to Texas Tech is going to be a tough game. And it's like, all right, can the talent win out, right? Can you make sure that like you take advantage of having more talented players and execute better and get those wins? Like you mentioned against the teams they should. Like that just to me is, you're going to have to win more of those games you lose, right? I think that what we're talking about here is you can't go 500 in the games where you're more talented, but it was like a tough road environment.
Yeah, and I mean, we want to say the same thing. It's like you said, it's tough to go to Manhattan, but we wanted to make it tough to come to Austin and play and win. And regardless of where we go, we want.
I've heard that home field advantage isn't great. I'll be honest. I've heard it's not excellent.
They talk about our wine and cheese fan base, but like I said, just from the product on the field, regardless of how the fans are in the crowd, when you look across the field and you see that burnt orange and white, we want it to be tough for everybody. And so that's hopefully what they're working towards. And, hopefully we'll see that manifest itself on the field this season. But yeah, I'm hoping this team could travel, it don't matter where we go, like once the ball is snapped, the best team is going to win, regardless of the environment. And so we didn't see that last year, but hopefully we can bring it this year for sure.
All right, Johnathan, where can people find you and find the show and anything else you'd like to plug? Go ahead.
Yeah, Jonzo Ball on Twitter, also Locked On Horns on Twitter, Locked On Longhorns on YouTube. Make sure you're subscribing. A lot of great UT content coming there. And, future Big 12 champions, your Texas Longhorns. We're back.
There you go. All right, you guys can find me on Twitter at @JoshNeighbors_. You guys can find the show at LO Big 12. You can find us on wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube. Johnathan, it was a pleasure, my friend.
Yes, sir. Hook 'em.